Great, thank you very much, Diana, and thank you to AFI for hosting this event. Okay, so Proto is a artificial intelligence company. We build a specific type of artificial intelligence called natural language processing, NLP for short, and this allows machines to understand human speech. We've applied this into the financial domain, specifically with financial supervisory authorities for the purposes of consumer protection. With the financial inclusion agenda, there are a lot of first-time financial consumers. However, there is also an increase in parallel in financial misconduct. And so the importance of the regulatory authorities to conduct efficient and effective consumer protection is more important than ever. The very first instance of this type of application of artificial intelligence was done at the Central Bank of the Philippines via competitive sponsorship by the Omidyar Network, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and others, of which Proto was the successful winner, and we have now deployed. And this is expanded into sub-Saharan Africa. So some more background on that particular deployment. The problem that the Central Bank of the Philippines faced was two-pronged. One, they had a very high expansion, very rapid expansion in complaint volumes that were being received from the population across the Philippines. However, internally, inside of the central bank, they only had 10 agents, so 10 consumer protection agents to handle that volume, and the resolution times were ever expanding. In addition to that, the traditional channels of complaint and recourse were exclusive, so it was not inclusive of the entire population. So the leadership decided to procure a chatbot system and a complaints management system, which most importantly should be able to understand the local languages of the Philippines, such as Tagalog, or the mixed language of Tagalog and English, which is Taglish. Across the AFI member countries, this phenomenon of language is consistent of mixed language and local language understanding requirements. This is now expanded into Africa, quite thankfully to the last AFI Global Policy Forum in Rwanda, in which we were also a finalist. So countries such as Rwanda, Ghana, and Zambia are also in the process of using this solution. Here's a description of the current manual process that was faced within the Philippines and within the financial supervisory authorities around the world. If you just follow my cursor, I'll walk you through this. So here you have the financial consumers. They will need to get recourse for financial consumer complaints, and those will go through traditional channels, such as voice calls, mail, or email. However, as I mentioned, these can be quite exclusive. For example, email, that's only open to consumers who might own a smartphone or a computer. Walk into a kiosk, that's only available to consumers in an urban area. It may not be possible, for example, for a historically marginalized segment, such as women or the elderly in rural areas who may not own a smartphone, to seek recourse. So that's the first problem. The next problem is that when the data is gathered, it goes inside of the central bank or the supervisory authority, and it's handled by a human consumer protection agent. And usually there's manual errors by no false intention or by no wrong intention. There can be errors in the data, the way it's categorized, the way it's processed and handled. What that means is over time, over multiple years, the data being gathered is not clean. It can be quite a messy data set. So if the intention over time is to do any kind of trend analysis for informed policymaking, the data that's being used is rather inconsistent. So using an automated system ensures and guarantees that you have a very reliable data set that's been properly categorized. So you can do stuff like the identification of market misconduct, for example. And here are the main pain points that come from a manual system like this. Typically across the financial institutions and financial regulators that we work with, there's 20-minute plus call wait times, 6-month complaint resolution times, and there's an expanding, rapidly expanding case volume, so 87% year on year. So a system like this, which is very manual and traditional, simply has no relevance in the modern context, and it needs to have some elements of automation to make it more effective for first-time financial consumers. Here's a description of the market problem. So if you're a central bank and you're going to go and procure a technology like this, you would probably face this market dilemma. At one end of the spectrum, you have the chatbot platforms, and there's thousands of companies that build chatbots. However, these are either too basic, rule-based systems that don't use real artificial intelligence, and they're not purposed for the regulatory or the enterprise environment. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have the natural language processing engines, the NLP engines, such as Microsoft Lewis or IBM Watson, and these are English-based. You have a real language problem, which is shown here. If you're using an English-based engine, which has not been localized to the domain and the local language, you might have context errors. So this is Chinese, just as an example. Liu shui and fan shui. These literally mean water current or betrayal. And that's likely what they would be understood as by a English-based system that is using translation steps. However, what they actually mean is amount of the offer or misspelling of another common term. So a very localized and powerful natural language processing system should be able to understand this context. So here's an example of the solution that is being deployed at regulatory authorities. So this is a chatbot that is powered by local language understanding, and it's deployed across many channels such as SMS, popular messaging apps like Facebook Messenger, and web chat on these central bank websites. Currently, the amount of complaint intents we processed is 140,000, and we've reduced complaint resolution times down to below 7 days. And interestingly, with the surveys that we gather for gender disaggregated data, we have noticed that there's an 88% higher usage by women of this system. And if you follow my cursor, here is the remodel. So this is what the new system architecture looks like once a solution like this is deployed. So here again, you have the financial consumers, and they can issue their complaints and request recourse through their channel, the channel of their choice. This is much more inclusive. So let's say that I'm a consumer and I complain through SMS. That would now be received by the chatbot. The chatbot would simultaneously send that complaint to the financial institutions, which are regulated, such as the banks or the microfinance. It would also be simultaneously sent to the central bank and stored in a local database. And this complaint is now being monitored for a resolution by the central bank. This removes several of those manual steps and allows an unlimited scale of complaints. From the technical perspective, in terms of improving the chatbot over time and making the artificial intelligence even smarter, all of the data that we collect becomes a structured data set. And we can use that to continuously retrain the language model. So there's a closed loop of learning over time. And even before the deployment, we can take an unstructured data set. So most of the central banks will have histories. They'll have chat histories or email histories, and we can use that as a training model. Here's a quick description of the products which are actually used by the central banks. So this is our build product, and we focus on API integration. So we can actually integrate into the central bank systems and automate a lot of those manual functions that might require human agents. And then finally, the track interface. So this is actually the interface that the Consumer Protection Agency use on a daily basis. All of the repetitive manual steps, such as categorization, the reading of complaints, forwarding of complaints to the financial institutions, that's done automatically. And this frees up the agents to focus on more serious problems, such as outstanding complaints, financial institutions that are not compliant. And a quick description of our implementation teams. So our implementation teams are all mostly natural language processing engineers. We are a global company of 40 people, and we recruit our staff from some of the top institutions for machine learning. So for the African projects, for example, most of the staff come from the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences. And to close out the presentation, for the central banks or the regulatory authorities on the call today, Proto is offering a 12-month pilot for qualifying supervisory authorities. And there are 3 remaining spots for Q1 being January to March. So if this technology is interesting or applicable to your context, feel free to send me an email at curtis@proto.cx. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Curtis. I will invite the panel of judges to express their question in case they have it. Do you have any question for Curtis? Also,
I think it's a general question. Curtis, thank you for presenting your project, which is very interesting for a central bank to follow to measure consumer protection. You talked about having this project in Africa. Can you please share your experience in implementing it in Africa, and also in which country did you implement it, and what was your return compared to your project in the Philippines? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So the expansion into Africa is for the central banks of Ghana and Rwanda in the Consumer and Competition Protection Commission of Zambia. So that's Ghana, Rwanda, and Zambia. And this project is going through the African Development Bank. So the African Development Bank has a special fund called the African Digital Financial Inclusion Facility, which did a call for proposals early last year. And that's now sponsoring the implementations at these banks. What we've noticed is the difference between Philippines and Southeast Asia and Africa is that the African central banks are able to be much more centralized. So if we just take Rwanda as an example, they're able to make sure that there's compliance with the consumer protection system. So they can actually corral the private sector, whether it's microfinance or large commercial banks, to be using the system. That's actually more attractive from the perspective of having better outcomes for consumer protection. So that would be the main difference that we found. In terms of the working relationship, there's really no difference. Every central bank around the world has these pain points, and consumer protection staff are being overwhelmed with financial consumer complaints. So there's a really good working relationship that we have with each of the central banks, who see this as a very viable solution for some of their current pain points.
Hi, I have a question. This is Nasser.
Diana, yo quisiera.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, Nasir, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Curtis, for your presentation. Two questions, actually. The first is, what is your rate of false positives, or maybe in this case, better to use the word false negatives on interpretation? And secondly, I think maybe I just missed this a little bit, but in terms of your actual readiness to go live, I'm assuming that this can be implemented. If somebody was to say, yes, we'd like this, you can implement or start the implementation process almost immediately, correct?
That's correct. So yeah, to answer your second question first, this solution is fully built. It's completely ready to be deployed. So if any of the central banks wanted to deploy and move the solution, we're ready to go immediately. The only caveat to that would be rare languages. So if it's a language that we do not yet support, and then we'll need about 2 months to gather the capability and to do the necessary training to be able to support that. But other than that, the software system itself and the platform is ready for deployment. In terms of the accuracy rate, so the amount of false negatives, false positives, this is a moving target. So on deployment for markets that have rare languages, so non-English or non-European languages, we're typically between 70 to 80% accuracy, the balance being a mix of confusion, which could be false positive, false negative, and that increases over deployment. I mentioned that there was a closed loop. There's a network effect that's being generated with more of the data that we receive, the stronger the system becomes. And I believe right now in the Philippines for Tagalog, Taglish, and English emotional consumer complaints, we're at 91% accuracy, the balance of that being a mix of false positives and false negatives in intent classification.
Okay, thank you, Curtis. Margarita, do you want to say something? Because I heard you before.
Yes, thank you. Tengo una pregunta para Curtis. Felicitaciones por el emprendimiento. Si pensamos en la educación financiera como un elemento que podría darle un valor agregado a la herramienta, ¿hay algo que tengan ustedes dentro del modelo que pueda favorecer no solo atender consultas en cuanto al cuidado del consumidor, sino también educarlo respecto de ciertos aspectos?
I'm sorry, I didn't have the translation up because I'm sharing my screen here. Is it possible for me to...
Okay. I want to ask you if you think about some component for the tool that can help to make not only these work to understand the complaints and help the authority to work with the complaints for the customer. So if you think in something to educate the customer with the tool, that's my question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the tool obviously is not only for consumer protection, that is the main function. However, the institutions that we work with also repurpose the tool for everything from FAQ, so common queries, to financial literacy, financial education. Really importantly for the financial literacy components and the education components, we're capable of doing proactive communication. What that means is that if there's a database of financial consumers, it could even be a national database of citizens, you're actually able to send out proactive messages with the system to their channels, to their messaging apps or their SMS. It's really important, especially in terms of rapid policy making for misconduct. So if we see a spike, an increase in, for example, fraud in a certain geographic region, you can actually send out warnings and alerts. You can educate the public with regards to those relatively real-time scenarios. Thank you for the question.
Curtis, we have one question.
Answer.
We have one question from the global audience. Do you have any experience working with banks in the Middle East, especially Arabic countries? And the other question is this solution directly accessible to central banks or could be adopted by commercial banks?
Got it. Second question first, about the commercial banks. Yes, so most of our client base actually is on the private sector side, and it's large Fortune 500 companies. We do work with the regulators simply because this is a very clear problem that we help to solve. And it's a pathway as well into the solution becoming very sustainable and having access to the private sector. So yeah, a lot of our work in the financial space is actually with commercial banks that are doing FinTech applications. So they're moving into the space of conversational banking, where they offer most of their banking services through a messaging interface, which is really important in global South markets. With regards to the Arabic world, the answer is we're active in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. We do support Arabic, but as of yet, we've not done any major deployments. We would be open to doing that with a regulatory authority or financial institution in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some minutes left, so I will check if we have another questions or reaction from the audience or panel of judges. Giselle, would you like to ask any question to Curtis or any impression? I have one question, so maybe I will start. Curtis, how do you envision your company in the next 5 years?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So within our industry in the natural language processing sector and the artificial intelligence sector at large, revenue is actually not the biggest target. The biggest target is data. So receiving a lot of data to make sure that the language models, the natural language processing models are very high quality and market leading. That's the most important target that we have. So working with ecosystems of regulators and financial institutions, or really any vertical that has a regulator and an operator side, that allows us to gather a tremendous amount of data, much more so than we would gather if we were just pursuing the private sector alone. So that strategy allows us 5 years from now to be the default automation platform for the Global South for domains such as Tagalog with financial terminology, or Malay with energy terminology, or Swahili with banking terminology. Thank you.
Hi, may I ask a follow-up question? Again, sorry, apologies, two interrelated questions. First question is, where's the data stored? Are you a cloud service or is the data stored and deployed on site? Secondly, maybe related, what objections or rejections have you had when talking to central banks, and what, in terms of why have they not taken your service?
It's a very good question. So the first answer for data and storage of data is we are a cloud-based solution. This is because a lot of the computer units, such as GPU computers for the AI system, it would be rather cost prohibitive to have that locally hosted. But it's a hybrid model. So the actual software system runs in the cloud. However, all of the consumer data, the personally identifiable data, all of that is saved locally. So we do a secure cloud connector into a local database at the central banks or financial institutions. So it's a hybrid model that allows it to be cost effective, but also keeps the data on the regulator or institution side. And then, pardon me, could you remind me again of the second question?
Yes, when dealing with central banks or with other financial institutions, why has anyone, or can you give us an example as to what are the main objections to sort of signing an agreement with you?
Got it. So for the central banks and regulators, there has not actually been any rejections. Our path into those types of clients is through sponsorship. So usually it's through year-long sponsorship projects where everyone does a letter of intent or an MOU ahead of time and everyone's in agreement moving into it. And in general, when it's a sponsored solution and there's no immediate procurement requirement on the bank side, there's openness to adopting this, especially because it solves such a severe pain point for the consumer protection departments. On the private sector side, what we find in the Global South is that the main reasons for rejection is actually around education. So quite often they're moving away from what are highly manual processes, maybe even paper-based processes, skipping over the digital phase and going right into artificial intelligence. So I wouldn't call it rejection, but it could just be a slower process than otherwise of educating the market and bringing them up to speed. Thank you.
Sorry, could I ask one more follow-up? Apologies, Diana, is that okay?
Yes, sure, go ahead. Sure.
What has been the impact of implementing your system on employment and productivity within an organization? Do people lose jobs?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. So the answer is no. We've not seen mass layoffs or even small layoffs from the system. It's a repurposing of the staff members. You have to keep in mind that the role that the chatbots and the automation system take over is very low level. So it's very repetitive tasks that even the agents themselves don't enjoy doing. Usually within these contact centers or consumer protection departments, there can be very high turnover of staff because the work is rather mundane. So we see a repurposing of the staff for higher order functions. So in the context of a central bank, it's repurposing of 5 of 10 consumer protection agents for investigation. So investigating financial institutions or for policy making. It's the sort of stuff that machines cannot do and that you need to apply humans to. Thank you.
Curtis, we have the last question from the audience. To integrate this platform, should the central bank provide sample Q&A sheet with all possible question and answer to Proto? This is the question from Central Bank of Uzbekistan.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a very good question. So yeah, a part of our implementation process, we'll request all of your FAQ, we'll request your business process and your consumer protection process, as well as other supporting materials such as the list of all financial institutions, service and products, et cetera. But in terms of the implementation, the most important part of this is data. So if you have any historical data of complaints, that's what we actually use to train on. So we'll train our AI system on that. And part of that process, we can also detect intents. So if your FAQ is not complete, maybe it's only 10% of all the possible intents that we would ever answer. By providing your historical data, we're detecting the balance of those intents as well. So if you wanted to know more, feel free to reach out to me at my email, and I can certainly walk you through how an implementation process would work. Thank you.
Curtis, thank you very much for your great presentation.